So we will continue with our study of the history of the Catholic Church, what happened to the Church during the first 2,000 years. We learned last time what happened to the Church during the first 1,000 years. As a matter of fact, we reached up to 1,054, the division between the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. Our focus for this evening is the history of Protestantism. How Protestantism started. What caused it. Okay. You know, the root of Protestantism really started out way, way back. It all started out with man trying to assert himself as a reliable, as one who can determine for himself the truth about God and would not need anybody to teach him or to guide him. Who doesn't, it's like sheep without shepherds. They think that they don't need anybody to shepherd them and that they can reach God on their own. Don't you think of that most of the time? That we can reach God on our own? We cannot. We need someone to shepherd us. And that is, of course, Jesus Christ. And Christ continues to shepherd us through His vicar here on earth, the Pope. We learned that last time. Okay. So what led to Protestant Reformation? It's way back. And it continued. All kinds of heresies persisted until in 1054, the Greek Orthodox Church decided not to submit anymore to the authority of the Pope, and that's the very first schism in the Church. And then finally, in the 16th century, Protestant, actually 16th century Protestantism started. What precipitated that? We learned last time also that the Church went through what we call the Dark Ages. Just a little review. What happened during the Dark Ages of the Church? The Church became secularized. Right? Lay people became involved in the Church and vice versa. And there was no ordination of some, yet they are able to hold clerical positions. Why? Because they had the money, they had the dough to buy the office. That was a great scandal in the Church during the Dark Ages, sometime in the 9th to the 11th, 12th, even up to the 12th century. There was this practice of simony, that is buying clerical offices. There was this, what we call the lifting of the discipline of what? Celibacy. Priests were allowed to marry. And it was proven way back then that allowing priests to marry is not at all good for the Church, because they get involved with materialism, with consumerism, because they wanted to take care of their family, and their focus is divided. We say that celibacy is being promoted. Celibacy is being promoted in order to get the Church people focused on their service to the followers of our Lord Jesus Christ. We say that they are married, as a matter of fact. Our priests are married. They are married to the Church, to their congregation. So they have all of their time are devoted to the service of the people of God. But during the Dark Ages, they experimented on priests not being married, and it brought about a lot of corruption in the Church. But again, we emphasized it over and over last time. No matter how corrupt the people running the Church are, the purity of the Church was never contaminated. All the teachings of the Church were kept pure and intact up to the present. Not a single teaching of the Church has always been has ever been changed in the face of all these corruptions in the Church. So we went through all of that. This contributed a lot in a cry for a change in the Church. A change in the Church. But change in change in the teachings. But some of them started going to the extreme of attacking even the teachings of the church. So that now is courting heresies and apostasies even. Okay. So the church started a procedure by which they can go after people trying to change the teachings of the church. We call them the heretics. Because what was happening was that those who are faithful to the teachings of the church have put the law, so to speak, into their hands. And anybody whom they suspect is not subscribing to the teaching of the church, they just mob them and even hurt them and even some kill them. So there was a mob rule during the 13th century. Okay? They wanted to go after these people who have been promoting heresies in the church. And the church, in order to put some order in what was happening during that time, set up what we call, I know you are familiar with this term, the Inquisition. Inquisition. What's the Inquisition? I know that we have a bad connotation whenever we hear the word Inquisition, but actually, Inquisition was intended for the good of the followers of Jesus Christ. Inquisition was there in order to counteract the mob rule, people putting the law into their hands. Inquisition is there in order to provide due process to those who are being suspected of heresy. It's not like, during that time, it's not like the days that we have. People don't care about what you believe in. During that time, if you don't believe in the church, you are really a target of violence. And people really are very, very almost fanatic with their belief, to the extent of hurting people who do not share their belief. Okay? So the Inquisition was set up in order to provide a counteraction to the mob rule that was all prevalent at that time. Okay? So, give them due process. The church set up what we call the Inquisition courts. And who were sitting in the Inquisition courts? The Dominican priests and the friars. And what was the purpose of these courts? In order to provide due process and find out, are you really a heretic? There will be a due process by means of trial so that you will have your day in court. You will present your side. Did you really promote this kind of teaching? So you can either deny or you can defend yourself, in other words, in these courts. So that was the intention of the Inquisition. That's why the Inquisition is really to determine whether or not the accusation that you are a heretic is true. If you are found to be really a heretic after some trial, after all this court procedure, the Inquisition court did not have the authority to mete out the penalty. This is where more or less the church committed a mistake by turning over the convicted heretic to the civil government. And when they turned over to the civil government, they were not far removed then from the barbaric times. Very harsh punishment were meted out. Okay? In fact, as a matter of fact, many of them were even burned at stake. You've seen that in the movies where heretics were being burned at stake. That was a common thing before. But put it in perspective too. They're not really by the millions. They're just by a few hundreds at most. But it has been exaggerated in press that during that time millions of heretics were executed and were burned at stake. That's not true at all. There were just a few of them really. Okay, so when the court determined that you are a heretic, the court during the time even gave all these heretics what we call time to recant their heresy. And this is where we got the term grace period, 30 days within which to recant. You've heard of the grace period, right? That's how it started. That started in the Inquisition. They provide you 30 days within which to recant your heresies. If you still do not recant it, that's the only time you turn over to the civil government for meting out of the penalty. Okay? Alright. And then, the church was starting to have a lot of problems. And it even became worse during the 14th century. This is what happened in the 14th century. There was a French pope who was elected. You know, most popes at that time were from Italy. And then one of the few times that when a pope not from Italy was elected, a French pope was elected. And so when he took the reign, the jail Peter, many Italian bishops sort of like intimidated him to, to ensure that it's their wishes that's being followed as far as administration of the church is concerned. So under pressure, this pope decided to leave Rome and transferred the seat of Rome from the seat of the church from Rome to Avignon, France. You know where Avignon, France is? Okay, it's a good tourist spot because the seat of that became the center of the church for almost 72 years. 72 years. That was our Rome at that time. Remember, in the history of the church, the very first center of the church was Jerusalem. That's where it started, Jerusalem. And then they moved to Rome because that was the center of civilization. And only in the 14th century, for the first time, was the center of the church moved from Rome to Avignon, France. And for 72 years, about 7 popes reigned in that place. Until finally, Catherine of Siena and St. Bridget were able to prevail upon a certain Pope, Gregory the 11th, to go back to Rome. Because that had always been the tradition of the church, to recognize the Bishop of Rome as the shepherd of the church. So, he went back. But however, when he went back, he not long after, he died. Okay? Now, here's another great problem that beset the church. You know that there was a time when there was more than one pope?
At the same time?
At the same time?
Wow.
3 popes at the same time, and even 4 popes at the same time. You know that? Okay. There are scandals in the church. And we have to learn all of them. What really happened in the church? This is what happened. Alright. Urban VI was elected pope, and the cardinals, he was an Italian pope, but he was elected because the Italian cardinals again were intimidating the cardinals to vote for an Italian, because probably another French pope, another French cardinal was a favorite at that time to become pope. There were politics inside the church too for this election of the pope. Okay, so they kind of like intimidated some of these cardinals, those who belong to the conclave. A pope is elected by a conclave of cardinals, certain cardinals only. So many of these cardinals, French cardinals, who were favored to elect a French pope, were intimidated so that, much to their dislike, they were forced to elect an Italian pope. So that's what happened. They elected Urban VI, an Italian. But not too long after that, they realized, no, we can't go on with a pope that we don't really like, because had we really cast our votes the way we wanted it, this other pope would have been, Arthur Cardinal would have been elected pope. So what happened? These French cardinals went back to France. And when they were there in France, they elected their own pope. We call that the anti-pope, a French anti-pope. That was Clement VII. Okay? To counter this. Yeah. So now, it's a lot of politics in the church. Then after that, the church confronted the problem. We cannot allow this. We are having 2 popes at the same time. So they said, this is what we're going to do. This is really threatening the unity of the the church. So why don't we all try to reconcile? So they called the conclave of cardinals again with the French cardinals and with the Italian cardinals and said, let's compromise. Let's elect somebody else, and we will ask these two popes to just resign. I said, okay, we'll do that. So they had a conclave and they elected Alexander V, a compromised pope. And then they asked the other two to resign. No, they did not want to resign. So we had three popes at the same time. Oh, terrible. What will the church do? Until finally, Marsilius de Padua, a saint actually, convinced the hierarchy of the church to call all the bishops. Not just the cardinals this time, all the bishops in the world. And let us elect a pope by all the bishops this time, not just the cardinals. Let's not have this because it failed to be, it proved to be a failure. So that's what they did. They gathered all the bishops in the world. They had like an ecumenical council just to elect a pope, and they were able to elect Martin V. So at that point in time, how many popes we had? Four. And then finally, they were able to convince two of them to resign, and one of them died. Okay? And so finally, we had just one pope. We call that conciliary. That was the very first time that a decision in the church was made by the Council of Bishops. So it cannot threaten the tradition of the church to have only the cardinals elect a pope, and that matters of importance should be decided only by the Pope himself. And of course, this is just a matter, an emergency measure taken by the church. See? We went through that scandal, so that if they started asking, isn't it true that there was a time there was more than one pope at the same time? That is true, and that was the story. Politics in the church. It does happen. We still have politics in the church. Again, we cannot overstress this. Church people are humans. Cardinals are humans. Bishops are humans. Some of them are really corrupt. Even up to now, there are some corrupt bishops. There are some corrupt priests, right? But I tell you, despite all of this, it has been proven that notwithstanding these church men, these church people who are corrupt, the purity of the church has never been contaminated. Very important. Okay, so in light of that, more calls for the reformation of the church became very, very strong. Okay. And the church was overrun by the development of Renaissance in art and culture. When was that? During the time of Leonardo da Vinci. Right? The time of all these great painters. So the different architectures of buildings, I think they were able to keep that intact. If you go to Europe, go to Italy, you see all those buildings there. They're part of, those were built during the Renaissance. Very, very artistic building. The Renaissance of culture. The church didn't want to be outdone, of course. And the Pope at that time, Julius II, thought that, okay, they've been building these great buildings. Let us build one of the greatest buildings ever for God. Let us rebuild the Basilica at Rome. Okay. You know, the Basilica was built during the time of King Constantine. But by the 14th century, of course, that's too old, and it's too old-fashioned built, too old-fashioned in style and all that. And so Julius II, during the Renaissance, says, okay, we will build a great church, the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. But we need a lot of money, because this is a very ambitious project, and we will adorn it with all this Renaissance art and culture. Okay, let's do it. We've got a response for that. So somebody suggested, hey, why don't we encourage them to contribute to the church by granting indulgences? you go. Indulgences. Let me give you first an overview of what an indulgence is. Okay. You might think it is something, it is a commodity that you can buy your way to heaven, like a pass to heaven. No. An indulgence really is a remission for the punishment due to the sins that you have committed, that you have to make a reparation for, but the church has the authority to grant you, in a form of indulgence, a way by which you can repair and atone for the sins that you have committed in the past. You know, when you commit a sin, there are two consequences: the guilt and the punishment due to the sin, right? The reparation for the sin. The usual example is if you break somebody's window, you didn't intend to do that, or you intended to do it, but you ask for forgiveness and you were forgiven by the owner. It's not enough. You have to replace the glass or the window, right? So that's what's called reparation, reparation, or atone for it. Now, how do you atone it? You atone it by way of the merits granted by the church, and it is in the form of indulgence. Okay. For now, we'll keep it at that, but I'll deal on it more in detail when we go to that subject. And that is a subject we will pick up in part 2. Okay? Right. So the church thought, okay, this is what we're going to do. We will encourage them to contribute to the building of this basilica by giving that as a condition for gaining a plenary indulgence. So, a plenary indulgence works this way. First, you have to go to confession. Because you can never gain an indulgence if you are not in complete grace. So you must be pure of heart. You must go to confession, you must receive Holy Communion, and then you do a thing that is prescribed by the Pope. So they thought, okay, we'll encourage them to go to confession, receive Holy Communion, and the thing to do that will be prescribed by the Pope is to contribute to the building of the Basilica. Okay? That's good. That's fine. That's fine. Okay? Well, we do that all the time. We raise funds for the poor. We raise funds for the building of our church. So per se, there was nothing wrong with it. But what happened? A lot of church people started abusing it. How did they abuse it? They started selling indulgences. It was never for sale. So people forgot about going to confession, receiving Holy Communion, putting themselves in the grace of God, and they thought, hey, I got the money. Let me buy 1,000 indulgences. See? That's what happened in the church. And Martin Luther was at that time already you know what Martin Luther was? The Augustinian monk. He was a priest. Martin Luther, the one that started the Reformation, he was a priest of the Catholic Church. He was a monk. And he noticed this, and he despised this. Who wouldn't despise it? That's corruption. But that was never sanctioned by the church. But that was not the intention of the church. The intention of the church is for these people to be holy, and part of the prescribed work is to contribute to the building of the basilica. Alright? So, what happened? When some of the priests started peddling the indulgences, and Martin Luther was really observing this very carefully. So all of these things, Dark Ages, the Simony, Inquisition, the scandal in the different claimants to the Pope, all of these are factors that slowly but surely culminated in Protestantism. They wanted to protest against the corruption. But what happened instead of protesting against the corruption, they started attacking instead the teachings of the church and the doctrines of the church instead of attacking the practices of the church people or the people running the church. Do you see the difference there? Okay. I mean, you don't question the divinity of Jesus Christ because the priest is corrupt, do you? You don't question purgatory just because people have been selling indulgences. But that's actually what happened during the Protestant Reformation. We call it throwing the baby with the bathwater. You want to clean up the baby, but instead of just cleaning up the baby, you threw it away with the bathwater. That's what happened in the church. Okay? It called for cleaning the baby. It called for giving the baby a bath. But it did not call for throwing away the baby, did it? Right, so that's exactly what happened.